The end of the American Revolutionary War brought an end of nearly 10 years of conflict. Yet the newly fledged nation still had many flaws, as expressed by the first Constitution and the effects spelled out from it. Yet things are not known to be broken unless tested, and two major events occurred that tested the new nation in law, governance, and unity. One that would force about change to the nation's constitution as a whole. Today's episode, we'll be looking at one of these events, Shays Rebellion. The economy during the American Revolution was largely subsistence agriculture, based in the rural parts of New England, primarily in the hill towns of central and western Massachusetts. Some residents had few assets beyond their land, and they bartered with one another for goods and services. In leaner times, farmers could normally obtain goods on credit from suppliers who would be paid when times were better for the individual. However, on the eastern end of the state, there was a market-based economy based along the bay and the Fertile Valley. This region was driven by the activities of merchants that were dealing with Europe and the West Indies, and the state government was dominated by this merchant class. With the end of the Revolutionary War, the merchants in Massachusetts refused to lend credit to these farmers, and they demanded that what had been lent to them prior be paid back in hard currency instead of regular goods. They extended this demand to their business partners all throughout the state, who in turn had to demand the same thing from their customers. The issue was that hard currency was extremely limited at the time, and they already needed to pay taxes in this hard currency. Many of the farmers were veterans from the war, but yet even the wounded ones would have been given little in the way of compensation from the state or federal government for their time. The rural farmers were unable to pay off their debt and taxes as well, with many of them losing their farms to debt collectors. Resentment, understandably, began to grow against not only the merchants but also the local courthouses, who would give judgments in favor of the merchants to seize the land for themselves. Most rural communities did attempt to use the legislature to gain relief. Petitions and proposals were repeatedly submitted to the state legislature to issue paper currency, which would depreciate the currency and make it possible to pay a high-value debt with low-value paper. And this is where an individual by the name of Daniel Shays enters the story. Daniel Shays was born in 1747 to Irish immigrants, and he was a landless farm laborer when the war broke out. He joined the local militia, fought in the battles of Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Lexington, and rose to the rank of captain in the 5th Massachusetts Regiment. He was wounded in battle and never got paid for his military service. When he returned home in 1870 to Brookville, he found that he was being taken to court for debts that went unpaid while he was off fighting in the war. Since he had not been compensated for his service, he had no way of paying these debts, and after attending several town meetings, Shays discovered that many other veterans and farmers were in a similar situation, and they banded together to petition the Massachusetts state legislature for debt relief. The governor of Massachusetts at the time, John Hancock, resigned in early 1785, citing health reasons, though some have suggested that he was anticipating trouble with the growing unrest, as two large-scale actions had taken place prior. Merchant James Baldwin was elected to the seat that same year, and he only worsened the problem. He ended up stepping up civil actions to collect back taxes, and the legislature passed an additional property tax to raise funds for the state's portion of foreign debt payments, and conflict soon erupted. In August of 1786, the state legislation adjourned without looking or addressing any of the multitude of complaints and petitions raised by the local populace. On August the 25th, a force of protesters formed in Northampton, and they successfully prevented the county court from sitting, calling for relief from the court judges that were depriving people of their land and homes. The courthouse in Worcester was closed on September the 5th for similar reasons, and soon the movement spread across New England. While Governor Baldwin didn't do immediate militia actions, other governors in neighboring states did, shutting down the unrest at the first signs of trouble. In Rhode Island, a group that were sympathetic to the protesters gained control of the legislature, and they passed bills that eased the farmers' burden from the merchant class, something that not only Baldwin was afraid of, but the vast merchant class in Boston was as well. The court was scheduled to meet next in Springfield on September the 26th, and Shay organized an attempt to shut it down in Northampton, while another leader of the movement by the name of Luke Day organized an attempt in Springfield itself. The Massachusetts militia commander Shepherd, he had anticipated this move by Luke Day and had gathered around 300 men to station themselves at the courthouse in Springfield. No fighting occurred at that day, and when the courthouse adjourned, Shepherd moved his men to the Springfield Armory, a rumored target of the protesters. For the next month, a multitude of courthouses across the state were shut down, with the courts in larger cities only being able to work if under the protection of the state militia. It was feared that civil war was about to break loose, so much so that Samuel Adams helped write up a riot act and a bill to suspend habeas corpus, pinning the protesters as British agents, instigating treason against the Republic, and they should be put to death. The legislators weren't as crazy, and instead moved to make some concessions, saying that certain old taxes could now be paid in goods instead of hard currency. These measures were followed by one prohibiting speech critical of the government, and they offered pardons to protesters willing to take an oath of allegiance. These legislative actions were unsuccessful in quelling the protests, and the suspension of habeas corpus alarmed many that weren't on the side of the farmers, which caused government support in the state to fall even further. Warrants were issued for the arrest of several of the protest ringleaders, and a posse of some 300 men rode out on November the 28th to arrest Job Shattuck, one of the main leaders and others in the area. Shattuck was chased down and arrested on the 30th, and he suffered a wound in the process. This action and the arrest of other leaders in the eastern part of the state angered those in the west, and they began to organize an attempt to overthrow the state government, and by mid-January, rebel leaders spoke of smashing the tyrannical government of Massachusetts. The federal government was very worried of this rebellion spreading, but it was left completely powerless in actually dealing with it. Under the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, the federal government had no way to raise militia units, so it was left to the individual states to act on their own. Governor Baldwin would do so, and he raised around 3,000 militia units, and he would place them under the overall command of former Continental Army General Benjamin Lincoln. Him and his men would march for Worcester on January the 29th of 1787. Shay's men in turn had planned to attack the Federal Armory in Springfield, being held by William Shepherd. When they advanced on the 25th of January, Shepherd's men were waiting for them, and they fired cannons at Shay's men, inflicting around 25 casualties. This alone broke the advance, and his men scattered, before regrouping in Armistice 30 miles to the north, but they would not be left alone for long. General Lincoln quickly marched after them, and Shay's men fled to the northeast to try and escape him, eventually setting up camp at Petersham, resting as a major snowstorm blew in, thinking that no one would advance in this kind of weather. But as per usual in history, they came anyway. Lincoln's men surprised the camp, and they once again scattered, heading into New Hampshire and Vermont to elude capture. This put an end to any large-scale rebellion in Massachusetts, and the state legislation passed a bill declaring martial law, which granted Governor Baldwin massive rights to expand the militia. Yet the biggest battle of the rebellion was still yet to come. On February the 27th of 1788, a group of 120 men crossed over from New York, and they attacked the town of Stockbridge, looting the merchant houses as they marched through, and they threatened to cause trouble for the state as a whole if allowed to continue. Since Lincoln's men had largely dispersed due to expired enlistments, Brigadier John Ashley mustered some 80 men, and he quickly set after the rebels. He would catch them at Sherifield on March the 1st, and the two sides did battle, in which 30 rebels were wounded or killed and the rest were taken prisoner, putting the final end to Shays Rebellion. 4,000 people would sign confessions acknowledging participation in the events of the rebellion in exchange for amnesty. Several hundred participants were eventually indicted on charges related to the rebellion, but most of these were pardoned under a general amnesty that excluded only a few ringleaders. Shay himself was pardoned in 1788, but he was vilified by the Boston press as an anarchist. He would soon move to New York, where he died in 1825, poor and obscure. His rebellion, however, would be the catalyst for massive change in the US government. The rebellion showed the pure flaws of the US federal government, and for years, many of the original founders had been clamoring for reform. A vigorous debate was going on throughout the states on the need for a stronger central government, with Federalists arguing for the idea and Anti-Federalists opposing them. Most scholars agree that the rebellion played some role in this debate, as it has at least temporarily drew some anti-federalists to call for a stronger government. A convention of all states was called for in May of 1787, and it was housed largely by strong government supporters. While some opponents were present, they were a vast minority, and so a new constitution was drafted, being signed by most members present. It was worried that Massachusetts, the state where the catalyst was from, would not sign on to the new constitution while all others had, as the rural parts were the hotbed for anti-federalist support. Yet, by a margin of just 13 votes, the state ratified the new draft, and thus a new US Constitution was put into effect. The new federal government now had military teeth, and it wouldn't be long before its first test would appear, as yet another rebellion was brewing in the nation, but that is a tale for another time.